Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Philanthropy. On today's episode, we are finishing off at least the initial round of the conflict series. This has been a series that was near and dear to my heart because conflict is everywhere, and I want people to have tools for how to navigate that conflict. So today on the last episode, we're doing the final default conflict type, which is confrontational aggressive. So if you've been waiting for this one, I'm glad it's finally here. I'm excited to do it. It is a very cold day in January, and so my studio is really super cold. And if you're not watching the video, you can't see that I'm like wrapped in a blanket. So it's a chilly day, but always a good day to learn about conflict. So I'm very excited for this. We will continue with the same format that we did for all the other default conflict types. The format is we will talk a little bit about the particulars of the default conflict type. Then we will go into the health risks, and then we will go on to how to have difficult conversations with this conflict type. And if you are that conflict type, so if you are confrontational aggressive, what is that like if you need to have a conversation with somebody? And then finally, what are some things that can help you to move towards becoming more assertive? So that's all that we have in store for today. And this is rounding out, it's the fourth default conflict type. So the three previous ones, you can find them in past episodes of Philanthropy. We covered first and foremost how to have a difficult conversation, finding your conflict type, and then of course we went into conflict avoidant default conflict types and passive aggressive and explosive. So if you are the type of person who was quiet for a long, long time and then one day you finally explode, that's the explosive conflict type. So those are the three previous ones that we covered, and now we'll do the final one, confrontational aggressive. So when you think of a confrontational aggressive person, I know it doesn't need an awful lot of explanation on my part because most of us have come across this default conflict type at one point or another. And it's characterized by really an aggressive approach to conflict, hence the name confrontational aggressive. So some of the things that you're going to find typical of a confrontational aggressive person is they handle conflict directly, but it's always with intensity, force, or domination. They raise their voice, they yell, they'll interrupt, they'll talk over you, they'll use threats and intimidation, blame, criticism, and often will do personal attacks. They have a lack of empathy, and really the key is that they are obsessed with winning at all costs. Conflict to them is a power game. And some of the health risks of this, because of course we've gone into the health risks of all the conflict types, because there is a cost to our physical, emotional, spiritual health. Whenever you struggle with conflict, you will often feel physical repercussions. And some of them for a confrontational aggressive person are high stress, burnout, anxiety, headaches, digestive issues, cardiovascular problems, isolation and alienation, and anger and frustration can be a symptom of unresolved trauma, anxiety, or depression. So this is the physical toll that your body may experience as a result of struggling with this default conflict type. And of course, before we get into the conversations, just a word on the different conflict types and why we default to them, right? This is when we are not taught how to be assertive in a healthy way. Often the struggle with conflict will push us in one of these directions, right? In one of these default conflict types. And it doesn't mean that, for instance, a confrontational aggressive person learned it because one or both parents were confrontational aggressive. That's not necessarily what it means, because they can come as a result of, say, having two parents that are conflict avoidant, or one is passive aggressive. Really, the default conflict types is just our natural response to conflict when we're not taught how to deal with it properly. So the aim of this series is to move all of these default conflict types into an assertive conflict type, so that we're not struggling when we have conflict. Because, of course, I've said multiple times before, conflict is not a bad thing. It is a bid for communication. It is a bid for connection. And of course, in a relationship, it is completely normal to have conflict at some point. And I always say, as long as you have two people in the room, it doesn't matter who they are or where they're from, at some point you will have conflict, because conflict is us trying to understand somebody else. It is a moment of misunderstanding. And so when we assertively work through how to, navigate conflict, hopefully that can help push us towards connection and better communication, a richer and deeper relationship. And so that's the goal, to not be afraid of conflict. And of course, I've mentioned it many times before, for myself, I'm a recovering conflict avoidant. And so I had to really do a lot of self-coaching and training to work myself through conflict avoidance into an assertive conflict type. And I'm not perfect at it. I still make mistakes. I still revert back to my conflict avoidant ways. And then I have to do a little check-in with myself and say, hey, wait a minute, Jess, what's going on? Are you avoiding conflict? Is this something that needs to be discussed? And so I hold myself accountable. And the same thing might happen to you, that, you'll definitely, if you're following this series and you're one of these default conflict types, that you will start practicing these things and they won't feel natural for a long time. You have to keep in mind, if you're someone like me, I'm in my 40s, and before I started doing this work, I'm going to say I had 30 some years of being conflict avoidant, and not always conflict avoidant. I said sometimes I would often, if I were drinking, for instance, I might revert to an explosive conflict type. And when we're with different people, we might be a little bit more assertive, or we might default into a different conflict type. But for the most part, I was conflict avoidant. And so, I'm still working through it, and that might happen for you. Whatever your conflict type is, you might end up having to work through it for a while, and it'll take a while before it feels a little bit more natural to you. And don't give up, it's going to take work. It took maybe 30, 40 years for you to get into the default conflict type that you are, kind of rigid into that. And so we're going to have to unlearn those things that we defaulted into. And it's a process. So give yourself some grace. And for those who are working with someone who is confrontational aggressive, just know that you can work with these people to an extent, of course. And we'll talk about when that's not feasible. But also, if that's your default conflict type, there's hope. I don't want you to feel that, you've probably had a lifetime of frustration when there's conflict because you want to handle the conflict. And like 75% of people are conflict avoidant because we have 4 different conflict types, right? And so all the other 3 are basically some form of conflict avoidance. And a confrontational aggressive is the exception. This is someone who goes full steam ahead towards conflict, but they do it in a way that is really intimidating. And that's a key marker of a confrontational aggressive person. It's the mix of power in there, that it becomes a power game for a confrontational aggressive person. It's not just about the conflict anymore. It's about control. And so if you're, for instance, somebody who wants to have a conversation, maybe it's your partner, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's somebody that you work with that's confrontational aggressive, and you need to sit down with them and you need to talk to them about an issue, whatever the issue is, but maybe you're a little bit freaked out to do it because you know how they respond to conflict and you know that it might get ugly. They might get really aggressive and because of that, you avoid the conflict because you don't want that eruption. You don't want to set them off. And so that's what this episode is for. It's really to give you some insight into what that means and how can you navigate this with grace, with love, with compassion, because it's possible. I always say to everybody that I came upon this information from my experience as a principal, that I was constantly navigating conflict around me all the time with staff, with students, with parents, and it just seemed never ending some of the time. And as I came across this information, I really started to learn more about what does this mean when someone's passive aggressive? How do we work with them? What does it mean when somebody's confrontational aggressive? How do we work with them? And I was forced to have to work with everybody and being a conflict avoidant person, oh my goodness. That's where I really learned how to become assertive. I had no choice. It was part of my job. And so that's how I know that you can move towards an assertive conflict type, because I had no choice and I did it. And I, for the most part, like I said, I'm pretty good with being assertive now. But it takes work. You have to put a lot of conscious, earnest effort towards becoming assertive. And you have to make that your goal. And you have to make sure that you are stepping into uncomfortable territory, because our comfort zones might not be healthy for us, right? Like our comfort zone, our normal could be toxic. It could be dysfunctional, but that's our normal. And that's where we understand the boundaries. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's good for us. So we have to learn how to step outside of that. And even moving away from toxicity, moving away from dysfunction into something that's healthier can feel incredibly jarring. It can feel uncomfortable. That doesn't mean it's not good for us. It just means it's unfamiliar. And that we unpacked some of that in the trauma episode. If you're interested and you want to go check that out, it was a few episodes back. But now we're working towards how do we have that conversation with somebody who is confrontational aggressive? Well, there are some things to keep in mind. And whoever this person is to you, it's important to you that you work through this issue. So we're going to get you through that, okay? And it's possible. One of the first things to keep in mind is that you are going to want to stay calm and centered when you're about to have this conversation, throughout the conversation. Okay, so you'll have to know how to regulate yourself or start practicing so you can pause, take a deep breath. You can, whatever it takes for you to stay calm, you're going to have to do that because for a confrontational aggressive person, they often will use tension to make themselves bigger. And so they will do whatever it takes to poke at you, to instigate, and to make you come undone so that they can feed off of that energy, and it validates and justifies their outlandish and very big behavior. And so it's really important for you to not fall prey to that you recognize and understand it is so vitally important for yourself to remain calm and centered throughout this whole conversation with this person, and to not fall prey to the tactics that they will use, because we went over some of those typical behaviors, like we're talking blame, criticism, intimidation, talking over you, personal attacks. These things can be very jarring, and if you're not mentally prepared for it, it can really catch you and trigger you. And then as soon as you're triggered, now you're going to fall into the trap of a confrontational aggressive person, and they will use power as a way to control the situation. And so for you to combat this, you're going to have to remain calm. You're not going to fall prey to whatever tactics they use, and recognize and understand that a confrontational aggressive person uses this persona because they're just as uncomfortable with conflict as you are, but that's the only way that they can feel in control. And to be honest, conflict makes us feel out of control, right? It often makes us feel uncomfortable. It puts us into a state, especially when we're dealing with another person, that we don't know what the outcome will be. And for a confrontational aggressive person, there is a fear underlying a lot of this, right? And the fear is that there will be no relationship, that they'll be alone, and so they have to use whatever they can to try and control the situation because of their discomfort. So you're going to have to stay calm and centered through all of this. And it will not be easy. When we're thinking of being calm, you're going to have to not only calm your energy, but your voice. You're going to have to make sure that you're not matching the intensity of a confrontational aggressive person, because as soon as they sense that you are starting to match them or you're trying to raise your voice a little bit higher than them, they'll go bigger. They'll go so bigger that sometimes they can get into a crazy zone where we're talking abuse. And that's because, the logical side of our brain, I forget which part it's called, but it shuts off. And we've talked about that in the trauma episode. We talked about that, and there's an anger episode earlier. And when anger enters, because it's such a large emotion, it blocks our logic. And if it blocks our logic, that's where you get into that crazy territory. It's very easy for a confrontational aggressive person to push their power to a level that they will regret at some point, right? And honestly, that's where we have murderous rages and that sort of thing, because people have locked into going bigger and going crazier, and it can be really terrifying. And so you want to make sure that you understand that when you're having this moment with this person, you're doing whatever you can to be calm. You are using a calm voice. You're not reacting to whatever they throw at you, because it could get really ugly. But you have to keep in mind that your safety is paramount, of course, right? And so if a confrontational aggressive person has started to get into that crazy territory that makes you feel wholly uncomfortable and unsafe, then it's okay to say, we are going to shut this down, that this is not a good time to have this conversation because I'm feeling unsafe, or I really need you to be calm and I really need you to be able to talk in a quieter voice, a calmer voice with me. And if you're unable to do that, then we're going to have to shut this down. And that has to be a firm boundary, right? And you have to mean it when you say that. You can't make a threat. And I'll give one example. When I was a principal, I had a situation. And there was a person who was in my office, and they were very, very upset with me. And they were shouting at me and yelling. And of course, confrontational aggressive person, sometimes they'll even stand up and they'll make themselves bigger to be more terrifying. And this person was basically, beside me and bigger than me and shouting. And I said, okay, we need to be able to have a conversation about this, but I don't think it's the time right now, because you're very upset and I want to hear you and I want to listen, but I'm not feeling that this is the right time. And if you are not able to control your language and this anger, then I'll have to call the police. Right? I don't have any choice. And then they still went bigger. They were still shouting. They were blaming and criticizing. And so I picked up the phone. I said, okay, I'm going to call the police. And I dialed the police station. And then they sat down and they said, okay, fine. Send the police to my house. And they wrote down their address and they said, yeah, I'll talk to them about this issue. And I said, okay. Good. But if you want to meet with me and talk about it with me, then we have to be able to do this in a civil way. And we have to be able to do this calmly, without shouting, without disrespect. And they left. And so that's something that you have to keep in mind, that when you're going into this, you might have to shut it down. You might not get where you want to go with this person. But if they're willing to meet you and they're willing to talk about the issue, then, hopefully just that little reminder of your boundaries will be enough to help them try to regulate themselves. And if you're able to, and you do get to that point and you're able to talk about the issue, it really helps to focus on the issue, right? And to not, again, be using you statements or anything that's going to trigger a confrontational aggressive person, because often it's better, and we've said this before on multiple episodes, that we use I statements. I think probably every single conflict episode we've talked about how it's important to use I statements. And so if we use I statements and we frame things in a way where we're talking about our own experience and the things that hurt us or upset us, that's really good information for a confrontational aggressive person, because often they get locked into thinking about only their thought, about only their feeling, and they often set things up to be very adversarial. And so they're used to thinking me versus you. And in that state of mind, they work hard to overpower, because for them, then it becomes a battle. I have to win. And so as soon as you use any terminology like you're signaling to them that this is an adversarial battle, and they will lock into their defense mechanisms. So if you instead frame it as, we need to solve this issue together, you and I, and whatever the issue is, that you're approaching it as a team, and the issue is what you want to solve, they're more likely to stay calm and not feel attacked and get on board and start working with you collaboratively, because they sense that, you want this to be a team effort. And in that, you also will need to practice active listening, right? So that's one way to diffuse the aggression, is to listen carefully. And that's a huge point for a confrontational aggressive person. The reason that they often go bigger is because they don't feel heard. And so they get to these levels of shouting because they feel like nobody's listening to them. And so if you're able to listen to them and give them the attention that they feel they're not getting, they're more likely to stay calm because they want to be heard. And so you're giving them that attention. And so they don't have to go bigger. If they're getting that attention and you're really actively tuned in, they'll be able to sense that, right? But ultimately, if they sense that you want to work with them and you want to listen to them, then you're more likely to have a successful conversation with a confrontational aggressive person. Now, if you are the confrontational aggressive person and you recognize that you have to have a conversation with somebody, and you know that you tend to domineer and take over and things go sideways when you get upset, then there are some things that you're going to have to keep in mind for yourself. This is a tip that's exactly the same as we mentioned in the explosive episode. If you want to gauge your anger on a scale of like 1 to 10. And if you feel like you're somewhere between a 7 and a 10, you're going in piping hot. Things are going to get out of control. And again, that's because the logic side has left the building and now your rage is taking over. And you know that when the rage takes over, that's when we see the Hulk, really. We see the green Hulk come out. And now it becomes a game of vindication, of, having the biggest insult or offense or anything that will give you leverage or power, and really just the ugly side that you're trying to avoid. Don't go in piping hot. Don't go in 7 to 10. If you know that you're upset, and obviously it's important that you address this issue, whatever it is that you're upset about, but it's better if you know that you're at that stage, to go off and to regulate, and then come back to the issue when you're at maybe a 3 to 5. Because at a 3 to 5, you still have a concern, and it's valid, of course, but you don't have the rage backing you. You'll be able to sit and logically talk this through with somebody. So if you are at a 7 to 10, then you're going to have to regulate, right? You're going to have to be able to do the things that are going to help you to calm your nervous system. And that's going to be different for everybody. You might have a bunch of things that you try until you know what really helps you as quickly as possible. And some of those things are, you could go for a quick walk, you could meditate, you could pray, you could have a quick shower, you could smudge, you could do some grounding techniques, you could also do some breath work. There are journaling. Lots of these things will help you to calm yourself and get yourself to that 3 to 5. And then after you've calmed yourself and you've said, okay, now I'm going to go to that conversation with this person, try and choose one goal that's very similar to what we said in the explosive conflict type episode, where we talked about if you have too many issues accumulated and you now go to that person, that's when it can become overwhelming to the other person, but also for yourself. You're going to be supercharging yourself with anger and deprogramming all the work that you just did to regulate yourself. So we want to avoid that. We're going to pick one issue, and it's going to be up to you to decide what that is. Is it something that you think is the most feasible? Is it the issue that you think is the most important? Whatever it is, you're going to decide what that is, and that's the issue you're going to focus on. And then when you go to have the conversation with the person, you're going to keep the focus on the issue. And you're going to work really hard to not create that adversarial situation that comes very easily to you. We want to frame it as a we versus the issue instead of me versus you. So that's a really key and important part, that you remember that you want this person, and maybe it is the issue of something that they've done, but try not to do the you situation where you do you statements. And that includes accusations, that includes blame, that includes assumptions, especially overgeneralizations. When people do overgeneralizations, that's when it can get really frustrating for the person who hears you say they always, they never. So it's really important to stick to I statements and also facts, right? And of course, we covered that too in probably the how to have a difficult conversation, the things to avoid in a difficult conversation. And those are some of them. So sticking to facts and saying, instead of saying, you're always late, you could say, well, last Thursday, I was upset because, you were late for this time or whatnot. And that's very concrete. That's something that somebody can work on. But when you say always, never, generalizations, or you accuse somebody, as soon as we make accusations or we assume things, it becomes adversarial, right? And we want to try and bring in the other person and approach it as an issue rather than a battle to be won, right? It's an issue that you can overcome together. So we're working on building that relationship. And I always said that too, that, when, as a principal, when I had to experience the sea of conflict and the outrageous amount of difficult conversations I had, that it was about relationship building. And I think most of us go into a conflict situation and we're afraid of what might happen because we think that the relationship will be broken, and we're not always ready for that. But a lot of times, if we approach conflict from a place of love and grace and compassion and patience, often the relationship can strengthen and it can get better because it leads to understanding. But if we don't approach it in a good way, if we lean into our default conflict types, that's when sometimes we end up severing relationships. And so it's really important that we look at how do we do this in a good way. So if you want to stay at a 3 to 5 in a conversation. You're confrontational aggressive. You want to stay. You've done work to regulate yourself, but you know that when you're in that conversation, you might end up starting to feel that anger building. So some ways to help you control that is to use a very slow, deliberate voice, right? So you are maybe even going to talk 50% slower and calmly. You definitely want to keep your voice low. You're not trying to raise your voice above the other person, but also noting those physical cues in your body, right? When you are really upset, notice what happens physically in your body, right? At that somatic level where we're considering, does my jaw get tightened? Does my knee go up and down? Do I clench my fists? Are my shoulders tense? Whatever it is that you do when you're upset, when you're in that difficult conversation, when you're in that conflict situation with somebody, let's note those things and say, hey, wait a minute. Okay, maybe I need to breathe deeply. Maybe I need to relax my shoulders, relax my jaw, relax my hands, have a fidget toy if it helps, but do things slowly, and notice those physical cues in your body, because you're going to want to calm yourself. You want to keep yourself at 3 to 5, right? And as soon as you start raising up, that's when tensions might happen. And the other party may say, I'm very uncomfortable and I don't want to continue this. And that might frustrate you as a confrontational aggressive person, because you obviously want a resolution to whatever this issue is. So it's important to keep yourself regulated as much as you can. And that's really hard. I know it is, but the more that we practice it, the easier it gets. And another thing to consider when you're in that space with somebody, you're trying to sort through a conflict, try and keep an open and curious mind. Try and listen to understand. So for yourself, you're going to be actively listening also. If they're meeting with you, maybe they're actively listening, and this is the first time you've ever been able to really express yourself, because nobody really ever listens. You always have to shout and get bigger. If they're actively listening, listen to them also, and be an active listener. Ask questions. Be curious. Try so hard to not jump to assumptions, to not jump to blame or accusations or anything like that. Try really hard to listen for understanding, because ultimately you want to advance this relationship. You want to improve this relationship somehow. And so it'll take a little bit of work. But if you keep a curious and open mind, you're more likely to be able to achieve that with this person. And then lastly, you're definitely going to want to end with alignment, right? So not dominance. Typically in the past, maybe as a confrontational aggressive person, you have to get that last jab in. You got to get that last word in. It's a power play. It's a battle. It's about winning. And in this situation, this new way of doing things, you're going to want to end on alignment, on teamwork with this person, right? So some things that you could say to help you stay connected at the end and not severed or adversarial, where it's me versus you. Instead, we're going to end on we. Right? We're going to end on teamwork, collaboration, connection, and some things that you could say to illustrate that would be something like, I want this to work. I appreciate you talking this through with me. Let's check in after trying out whatever your plan is. And that'll really help the other party to feel not attacked, right? We don't want them to feel attacked. We want them to feel that their thoughts matter just as much as ours do. And so when you try that collaborative teamwork approach and you work really hard to regulate yourself throughout that, you're more likely to achieve some kind of happier resolution for the goal that you came in with, right? Now, some other things to keep in mind if you are working towards becoming assertive and you're confrontational aggressive, a reframe on power. So thinking of assertives, maybe in the past you've thought of assertive as weak, but it's not, right? So I know typically in the past you had to go bigger and you had to win. And now you're learning a new way of looking at it, a new way of thinking. And I want you to understand that being assertive is an invitation to others to enter into a mutually respectful relationship. That's what we're asking when we're being assertive, that we are being respectful and you're being respectful with me. And we're going to navigate this conflict together because we both matter, right? And so that's what's happening when we're entering an assertive relationship. We are entering everything respectfully. So instead of like what we talked earlier, so that means we are, of course, no longer looking at things as adversarial, right? It's not about me versus you. Now it's about we. We is a really big key part of transforming from confrontational aggressive into assertive, right? It's relationship building. And so something that you could try is asking for feedback, right? Because this is new terrain for you and the people around you know you very good. And so if you ask them, like, I'm really working towards becoming assertive and it's very new to me and I'm not sure how I come off to others, right? So if you could just let me know if I'm coming on too strong or too intensely, or if I say something that seems about more power and control, let me know, right? Like I need to know, because sometimes what we think we're saying and doing isn't always perceived that way by others. And so it'll be really important that if we get people on our side to help us, then they can sometimes say, you know, the tone you used was a little bit too loud, or maybe if you had said it a little bit gentler. Feedback can be a really good tool for us. But of course, it has to be with somebody that you trust. And also, we have to not be so sensitive, right? Like we have to be willing to go into this. Like I said, we are going into uncomfortable territory. It's not you. That doesn't mean it's bad. Sometimes it's going to take us a while before we get into that groove, before it starts to feel good and it starts to feel natural. Somebody, you know, those people around us that we trust, they'll be a good gauge to help let us know if we're succeeding or not. And you can also practice being assertive in low stakes situations, right? We don't always have to practice being assertive when we're raging hot, angry. Like we can try it in different scenarios, because if you use power and control when you're super angry, you might notice a pattern that you try and do that around you all the time, right? And even in little ways. So start to notice your own patterns and start to notice, you know, if you find that you're using power as methods of control around you, then start to take notice of that and approach that maybe a little bit differently. Try being a little bit more assertive. And lastly, of course, I always end with, you can try things like role plays. Role plays are a great way to practice these skills. You can do them in a mirror, you can do them with a friend, you can do them with a pet, but they can really help us. And you could even write out a script of, let's say you have to have a difficult conversation with somebody. You could write out a script of, if I say this, this is what they might say. Often, if it's somebody we've already had a difficult conversation or we've already had conflict with, we might know what their responses are going to be. And if you write that out on your script, that might help you to understand where you're being reactive and where they're being reactive. When people are being reactive in conflict, it is often because you're relying on your default conflict type. And so when we choose our responses, that's coming from our higher self. That's coming from our assertive self. That is us walking away from a lifetime of conditioning. And we're deciding instead, I'm going to do things in a good way, to be respectful. And so it feels unfamiliar to me, but I'm going to do it anyway. And if you write out that script, you might be able to identify where you're being reactive or where they're being reactive. And And instead, like, let's substitute some responses because we know they might say this. So then what could I say instead? And that might mentally help you prepare before you actually go into that situation with somebody. And that might also help you with that regulation piece too, because if you've already kind of seen it in your mind's eye, then now when we actually are sitting in the situation, maybe we'll have more control of our responses. And journaling can always help too, right? So often that's something that I've used even as a conflict avoidant. I've written when I've been very, very upset, and I'm writing in my journal, and eventually I can feel myself regulate and feel better, and suddenly I often have the solution. Whatever I was really upset about, I have clarity because I start to see the issue at play, and then I'm able to figure out a response and what it is that I'm really needing. And so that might be something that might really help you too if you're working on transforming from a confrontational aggressive person to somebody who is more assertive. And lastly, if you're still struggling, you're trying everything that I've suggested, and you're still struggling in your relationships, or maybe you just want more support, you can always go to a therapist and you can identify and say, hey, this has been my typical pattern in conflict, and I need some more tips, some more support. Then therapy and coaching are really great tools. And there's no shame. There's no shame at all if you recognize this is your default conflict type and you want to change. You can 100%. You just have to put in the work. You have to definitely say, okay, you know what? This is not working for me and I need to change this. I don't like what happens in my relationships as a result of my response to conflict. And I want to do things in a new way. And I want to approach a conflict with love and grace and patience, compassion, and you can. It's 100% possible, and I believe in you. So I'm very excited, and thank you to everybody who listened. I hope this episode helps you. If you have somebody in your life who is confrontational aggressive, maybe this will help to unlock a new relationship with them. And if it's you and you're listening because you are not happy with how things have been going, well, there's hope, and now maybe you have some tools that can help you. And so thank you, everybody. I've really loved doing this series, and I'm really grateful to everybody who tuned in, and I hope you got something great from it, and I hope it helps your relationships first and foremost. That's the most important thing. So thank you, everybody. Take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.